Now, who hasn't seen the images of the Edward Colston statue being torn down during the anti-racism protests in Bristol last weekend? Well, here in Gloucestershire, tucked away up a side street in Stroud, is the country's oldest memorial to the abolition of slavery. I've been talking to a Stroud journalist who's been researching Gloucestershire's links with the slave trade. I've been to Paganhill to find out more. I'm in Paganhill and I'm just standing on the start of the estate here, which leads up to Archway School. I don't know how many times I've driven past the archway here and not realise what it's all about, what it represents, until I read an article by Amplify Stroud, and I'm joined today by Jamie O'Dell, who wrote the article, and also Cassius Smith-Fraser, who's also from Amplify Stroud. We are safely distanced away from each other. Jamie, how many people do you think drive past this archway without realising what it is, just like me?
So I went to school in Marling, and I live just up the hill, and I walk past this every day. I don't think it was until about sixth form time that I actually looked at the plaque and thought, I didn't know this was here, until I learnt that this is the oldest and one of the only kind of memorials to the slave trades in Britain, and it's not even on Google Maps. So there's a real kind of problem there about how we kind of remember what's right on our doorstep when it's such a significant thing.
So how did this archway come about then?
So this was built by Henry Wyatt in 1834, but he was quite a prominent member of the Stroud Abolitionist Society, and the Abolition Society was kind of part of the wider abolitionist movement, which is most commonly remembered through William Wilberforce, and that's kind of what we most associate with kind of Britain's involvement in the slave trade. It's kind of the abolition in 1833.
So there's only one of its kind in the country as far as we're aware, so have we got a lot to be proud of here in Stroud?
Monuments are a way that we kind of try to concretize a particular moment in history, so it kind of it propagates throughout, and we need to recognize that these things are very contentious battlegrounds. What is crystallized here, and this is a bit of stone, but what's really going on here are human relations.
It's an interesting one because if you contrast it to kind of the statue of Edward Colston, it's very different. But when we do remember it, and we do have that sense of pride, and I think when Britain talks about the slave trade in a wider sense, we usually remember it as, well, we were the first country to abolish it. There's problems with that for several reasons. The first of which is we weren't the first country to abolish it, Haiti, in 1804. Well, the way we remember the abolitionist movement is very much about particular people like William Wilberforce, like Henry Wyatt, being seen to be kind of in this white saviour role. And they are the only voices that we remember, and the only ways we think about it. And that kind of allows us to separate ourselves from the actual horrors of what centuries of chattel slavery and just exploitation was. That also allows us to kind of really think, well, this is like a cut-off, a historical point where slavery ended, we ended it, and that separates us from places like America. The difference between us and America is not the presence of racism, but the fact that they had racism on their soil, whereas our deep south was in the Caribbean. So we have that physical and thus mental separation from it, which is a real kind of key issue in how we remember and talk about this.
So we're not without blame here in Gloucestershire when it comes to the slave trade, and there are a lot of people who lived here who benefited from being slave owners.
Yeah, so there's a local historian called Stuart Butler who's part of the Radical Stroud group, and what he's done, he's gone through the UCL have put together some records of all the slave owners in 1833. So what happened when we abolished slavery is that we spent vast amounts of money. So we spent 40% of national GDP at the time compensating the slave owners, not those enslaved, but the slave owners. So people like Samuel Baker, who owned, I think, 410 slaves, he was given around about £8,000 in that day's money. Now that, roughly, when you equate for inflation and kind of size of GDP, that's about £40 million in today's money. And Samuel Baker, that's who Baker's Wharf is named after in Gloucester Quays. So we can kind of see, like Edward Colston, who invested so much of his profits from the Royal Africa Company, we can kind of see how the profits from slavery and the profits from slavery compensation were invested back into our local physical environment.
And who compensated the slave owners?
The British government, because we stopped paying the interest on this in 2015. So your taxpayers' money, my taxpayers' money, went towards the interest for the abolition of slavery. And they tweeted that out very kind of proudly, and people kind of realised that the tweet was actually a little bit tone deaf because we compensated the slavers, not the enslaved. And that's where there's a really interesting discussion about reparations, because the only compensation that's ever gone out for slavery has gone to white slave owners who did very well out of it.
What I find really remarkable is that this article was published mid-May, so before George Floyd's murder. What do you think the world has learnt since then?
I don't know whether I put the emphasis so much on learning as opposed to what I see is motion. I see action being catalysed. I see things changing, and I see awareness, and that is a precondition for learning, right? If you want to take pride in your history, if you want to entangle yourself and entangle your identity up with something like a place or a nation, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have it that you remember the good bits but not the bad bits. It's a kind of mature way of coming to look at your history. It's not about self-flagellation. It's not about beating ourselves up. Though there is room for kind of symbolic apologies, but only insofar as they acknowledge the contemporary manifestations. And it's really about that history. What it can do is it contextualizes the present, right? It's like contextualizes the present and helps you realize what the contemporary structures are, your place within them, so that you can dismantle them.
So much of what I've seen over the last few weeks is that people are willing to learn about this. People want to know about this. They just don't know about this. And it's a classic thing, like we're not taught about slavery, racism, colonialism in school. And until we are, I don't think this will become a natural thing. We always think we're a very divided country at the moment. Well, if you want to heal divisions, then you've got to heal divisions based on your actual history. And it's things like you can't understand why black people are 4 times more likely to die from coronavirus if you don't understand the history of slavery and the legacy of colonialism and why these structural inequalities are there. And why is there racism today? And without understanding things like this arch, you can't understand that.
My thanks to Jamie Odell and Cassius Smith-Fraser from Amplify Stroud. And if you'd like to read Jamie's article, and there's so much more to this story, you can go to their website, which is amplifystroud.com. It's called Stroud, Slavery and the Misremembering of William Wilberforce. It's about the 4th or 5th story down. There's also lots of information online about historic slave owners in Gloucestershire. And you may have heard Jamie say the arch in Paganhill doesn't even appear on Google Maps. Now, I've approached Google Maps in the week to ask if they can add the arch to Google Maps. And so far, I've not had a response from them. As soon as I do, I'll let you know. It's BBC Radio Gloucestershire.